today with a sad note. We all know that we've lost our former Prime Minister, who also happened to be a great economist. So, in homage to the former Finance Minister, former Prime Minister, and a professor from our own community, an economist, so we would like to keep homage of our respect for the departed soul. We pray that everything that he has done inspires us, the economic reforms, as well as a number of things that he did as the finance minister, which many of us economists thought are important, continue to be milestones and inspiration for us. With this, let me welcome you to the EGROW Friday webinar series. As you know, we are almost done, nearly 252 webinar series so far. And our objective and purpose has been very clear in this webinar series. We have tried to bring the best minds across the world to discuss contemporary issues, both domestic and global. We have been very privileged and honored. We have already hosted 3 Nobel laureates. In February and March, we are again hosting 1 Nobel laureate in each of those months, 2 of the 3 recent Nobel laureates. So we feel very privileged in that sense. The issues that have been covered in these webinar series have been very, very complex. They have been from the Indian economy, from global economy, from social sectors like poverty, unemployment, also geopolitical concerns. In recent times, there has been lots of data which has come out, which has been very interesting for policymakers in our country. And recently, there were studies done by Dr. Shamika Ravi from the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, which were very much research-oriented, policy-oriented, and this had something to do with the consumption function, female labor force participation, very contemporary issues. Today, we have invited Dr. Shamika Ravi to come and speak to us about one of those issues that she has been flagging. To chair the session today, I'm thankful, especially invited Dr. TCA Anant, who was the chief statistician of our country, who was also member of the Union Public Service Commission. He has been an academician, professor and head of Department of Economics at the Delhi School of Economics, and he has played a significant role in the academic circles in our country. He received his PhD from Cornell University, master's from DSC. He was assistant professor in economics at Michigan State and reader and then professor in Delhi School. So we thought we will have the blessings and the guidance as well as the rich experience that he brings as former chairman, former chief statistician of our country. He was also member secretary ICSR. As far as Dr. Shamika Ravi is concerned, the main speaker for the day, we all know her and we all respect her work and we all have benefited from her work. She is currently a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister and Secretary to Government of India. Earlier, she was Director of Research at Brookings India, Vice President Economic Policy at Observer Research Foundation, and non-resident Senior Fellow of Governance Studies program at Brookings. Her research focuses on economics of development, including areas of finance, healthcare, urbanization, gender equality, and welfare and poverty. With this, I would like to mention that Dr. Ravi has a PhD in economics from New York University, master's from Delhi School of Economics, and bachelor's in economics from Lady Shri Ram College of Commerce, Lady Shri Ram College for Women in Delhi. With this, I hand over to Professor Anand to take the proceedings further. Professor.
Thank you, Professor Charan Singh. Let me also thank EGROW Foundation for hosting this webinar and inviting Shamika to come and talk to all of us. Shamika has been a very active researcher and one of those who has been pushing for greater use and focus on empirical work and thinking about issues but drawing understanding from better data analytics, something which I have appreciated in all the things she's been doing over the years, because she's been one of the most prominent users of NSS and other data, particularly working with disaggregated unit level data and deriving insights from them. So I'm very, like all of you, I'm very keen to listen to Shamika's observations on new data, and the topic is new data in New India. So let's get Shamika to speak, and I may have things to add to it or query her, and I'm sure some of you may also have issues to discuss. So we'll see how much time we have after she finishes the talk. I'm not going to come between you and Shamika. Shamika, you have the floor.
Thank you, TCA. To those of you who don't know, TCA taught me at Delhi School, and we go many, many decades back. So it's wonderful to see you, sir. Thank you, Charan Singh ji. It's always wonderful to associate with you. We have been not through either your design or mine, but we have ended up on several platforms together, and I for one feel grateful for these opportunities. Thank you to EGROW Foundation for putting this together. The topic today was based on the recent work that I put out as the working paper. In fact, I'm going to talk about two sets of things today. They're both based on the MOSPI data that have been released this year. I'll first start by talking about, well, new data, new India, because there are many things happening even within the Ministry of Statistics, which have to do with improvements in the quality of data, making it more representative. Many efforts have been tried over the last several years, which have come into fruition over the last several years, but even now, in terms of raising frequency of some of these data. As you might be familiar, the consumption data has been made available after a gap of nearly 10 years. So it becomes a very important time to look at what is happening to India's consumption of, let's say, average Indians, and a little bit over the distribution, meaning how are the poor consuming, how are the rich consuming, is there convergence, is there divergence, etc. So lots of open empirical questions. Now, to the researchers in the room, particularly the younger lot, I want to encourage you to go to the data and see many things for yourself. Many of us have specialization, especially when you start out, as assistant professors, when you're PhD students. We are narrowly confined to the interest of our own thesis and our own specializations within economics. But as you get older, there are many exciting things that emerge, and I think there is also a professional sort of a duty and a service that fall upon you, because this is a very dynamic economy. India is not just one of the fastest growing economies. It has been the case for the last few decades, but it's also a young, and it's an economy which is still under $3,000 capita per year, which means we continue to grow and experiment with policies and lots of new things happening. Besides the fact, of course, it's the size of a continent, and you should really think of the economy as vibrant state economies, which are in their own way experimenting with many things. So what I'm trying to tell you is then in that kind of a situation, it becomes very important to get a sense of how things are on the ground, right? Beyond the theory and beyond what the laws are meant to be. Empirics and real-time data analysis, and by real-time, of course, I mean based on the data which is most recently available, it almost becomes a duty to look at first-order questions. And that's what I'm going to present to you today, to give you a sense of how things are. One, in terms of what is happening to our consumption, right? Household consumption expenditure survey is what I'm going to look at. Then we will also look at labor force participation rate in terms of, particularly with more focus on women, but I will also look at men, because these are large questions which the literature did not look at. I found gaps, and hence, whenever you find gaps, particularly for India, it's best to just go to the data and try to address some of them. But also remember, there is an entire industry. We have a lot of literature which has focused on the decline in female labor force participation in India from 2004-5 to 15-16. So then it becomes important to see, well, what is the situation today? And then finally, I want to, if I have time, I will introduce you to new kinds of data. Which don't have human error, because these are satellite imagery and there's daytime. I know you're familiar with the nighttime, but there is all this new data available, which is 10 meter into 10 meters high resolution. So many things can be answered from that, right? And of course, the idea is through all of this, you have a better understanding of the economy and what is policy making, therefore, for Viksit Bharat 2047. Let's start off with how the consumption pattern in India is changing. Over the last 10 years, because what you have is the NSS data from 11-12, and then you have the most recent one from 22-23. You know, this is data made available by MOSPI. They look at household consumption, and the sample size, of course, in the last 10 years has increased, from just over 1 lakh households to now we have more than 2.6 lakh households. So there is obviously an increase in the sample size, but the sample size itself, while we care a great deal about sample size, but if we have time, we will see that there are issues with the size of the sample alone does not address. But the good thing is now that it's becoming more and more representative. And of course, as we've been told, subsequent rounds, the next rounds of NSSO is also attempting to help us with sampling in a way that we might have estimates at the district level. So that is actually a very welcome sort of innovation within MOSPI. Now, so what has changed in the last 10 years? Well, average per capita monthly expenditure has increased 164% in rural areas, and in urban areas, it has increased by 146%. So these are big changes in terms of just the nominal amount, right? Just in terms of the per capita expenditure at the monthly level. But if you look at some of the big trends which we see, then for the first time in modern India, food is now less than half. As you know, in our CPI, the way we measure inflation, food is in fact, it has about 55% weightage. But what has shifted on the ground is on an average, it's less than 50%. And I'll give you the urban-rural breakup in a minute. Diet, if you just consider food, has become very diverse. Households are now eating a very large number of food items in terms of food groups, and it has direct impact on micronutrients and hence on health. So I'm going to show you all of that empirically. When we look at asset ownership, particularly amongst different quintile groups, then we are seeing some of the fastest increase happen within the poorest quintile, all right, the poorest 20%. And then one other statistics is looking at vulnerability of household, that when you're hit with a shock, let's say hospitalization, do you fall to the consumption level below yours? So suppose you're in the top 10 decile, do you then fall to the next, right? And that's a measure of vulnerability, because traditionally we have looked at health shocks leading to impoverishment. Do you fall below poverty line? But now as India's poverty levels itself begin to go down, and you know, in terms of the $1.9, we are below 3% now. So now absolute poverty going down means we'll also have to look at alternate or different kinds of measures, such as vulnerability, falling below your own class of consumption. And then we look at what impact does it have for the CPI very immediately, agriculture policy. If people are eating differently, how should our production decisions now begin to reflect that? It has direct bearing on health and nutrition, and I will show you some statistics, and then to some extent urban planning. Now, this is the one broad statistics for rural India. What you notice is food used to be 53%, now it is 47%, right? And for urban India, food used to be 43%, now it is 39%. So food as a proportion of overall consumption expenditure is now significantly below what the current CPI, the way we estimate the weightage that it has. And that's an important point as far as policy making is concerned, which means we now need to rethink and come up with a new framework for how we estimate inflation. Within food, you will see cereal used to be 11% of the monthly consumption expenditure. Now it is down to 5%. This is rural India, right? But on the other hand, what you see is processed and packaged food, from 6%, it has risen to 7%. If you look at durable items, it has increased from 12 to 13, but consumable and services have risen from 35 to 40%. And within that, you are seeing conveyance go from 4%, now it is up to 7%. So conveyance related expenses are rising. If you look at, let's go back to rural. If you look at pan, tobacco and intoxicants, meaning alcohol, it used to be 2% of the monthly per capita consumption expenditure of rural households. Now it is 5%. Okay. And in fact, if you look at this for the bottom 2 quintiles, then it is much larger share. Also, please note the spending of the bottom quintile in rural areas on pan, tobacco and alcohol is actually more than the spending of this quintile in rural areas on education and on health. These are very important policy implications. In urban India, the movements are very similar. If you look at, again, conveyance has risen from 7 to 9. But again, the big changes are cereal used to be 7%, now it is down to 4%. Again, if you look at consumption of processed and packaged food item, the expenditure used to be 6%, now it is up to 8%. Another thing to remember, that over time, remember the overall spending is also rising. So the shares are rising for these things, but in absolute terms, these are major increases because we are showing bigger rise in proportion, but it's a larger proportion of a larger pie, overall spending. So in absolute terms, there is a lot more spending changes that are happening. So food is less than 50%, and in urban areas, I showed you, it's down to 37%. A share of cereals, rice and wheat in particular, has fallen sharply from 11 to 5% and from 7 to 4% in urban areas, right? So big changes. Conveyance as a spending, share of spending has risen sharply. Pan, tobacco, alcohol has doubled, and the share of jewelry and ornaments have risen, doubled in fact overall. And again, this is the case also for the bottom quintile. If you look at now the proportion of the food expenditure, then the top 5 bars are for 10 years back and the bottom 5 bars are for the latest round, so 10 years later. What you notice is across every quintile group, the red bar is shrinking. So overall spending on cereals is actually falling for everybody. What you see is spending on milk and milk product is rising. Spending on processed food is rising much more sharply in the top quintile. If you look at fruits, it is rising. So these are big changes, all right? Same case for urban India. In fact, for urban India, just look at the share of the top 10% on processed and packaged food. It is 27.2. So that's a very, very big increase, right? Now, keep in mind that if you're looking at it from the public health perspective, there are concerns which have to do with packaged and processed food because they tend to have more preservatives or sodium. It is likely to have a terrible impact on healthcare. Again, these are empirical questions, but also remember from a growth and development perspective, an agricultural economy, as you progress, food processing and packaging is naturally the next value addition in the chain of advancement or progression of an economy. These are also sectors where new jobs are created. These are sectors of growth. So in many ways, this becomes a very natural stage for an economy such as ours to see this segment increase. But we are also sensitive to what impact it has on health. Now, let me show you some statistics in terms of if the share of cereal is falling. I'm going to show what are the other things on the food plate, because I'm interested in health outcomes from a changing consumption pattern of food. How many people are eating fresh fruits? Right? The percentage of people across the top to the bottom quintile who reported eating some fresh fruits. 10 years back, 63.8% households on an average said they consumed some kind of fresh fruits. Why fresh fruits? Because this is more sensitive to logistics and transportation than dry fruits. Okay, so that's why fresh fruits are an important category to study. What you see is now more than 90% on an average of households are reporting that they are consuming some fresh fruits all the time, right? The other thing to note is the biggest increase is at the bottom 20%, where 44% used to consume fresh fruits of some kind. That number is almost doubles, it's 82%. So you've had 86% increase in the bottommost category and 43 overall. But NSS data makes many other things possible. Not just that I am consuming some kind of fresh fruits, it also helps you understand how many kilos, what is the actual quantity that is getting consumed across different quintile groups. What you will notice here is that in terms of actual quantity consumed, it used to be 1.9 kilogram per person per month. It has risen to 2.7. So you have a 42% increase overall, right? But what about the quantity increase at the bottom? 20% population, it has increased from 0.8 kilogram to 1.5. That's an increase of 87%, right? Please also bear in mind, because we are interested in what is happening to the consumption inequality. So on top of each scale, you're also seeing something called scale. That is the ratio of the consumption amount of the top quintile to the bottom quintiles. So the top quintile used to consume 4 times more kilogram, right, in terms of quantity than the bottom quintile. That number has reduced to 2.8. So you're seeing a convergence or reduction in inequality in terms of amount consumed. So this is the case for fresh fruits. What about quantity of fresh fruits in urban India? On an average, it used to be 2.7 kilogram per month. That has risen to 3.5 kilograms, right? 30% increase overall. But again, for the poorest households in urban India, it is a 54% increase. Again, look at the scale from the top to the bottom ratio. It used to be 3.5 times. Now it is 2.7 times. Again, there is a convergence or a reduction in the inequality of the amount consumed. Where are these increases happening? Just look at the region. From north, central, east, northeast, west, and south. Look at the number of households, just in terms of how many households are now consuming. Look at what has happened to the latest figure. Every region is seeing a massive expansion. Some of the biggest increases, however, have happened in the most remote areas, such as the northeastern parts of India. And this is where the fresh fruits as a category becomes important, because these are the regions where we've had the biggest expansion in the supply chain and transport, right? Storage facilities, etc. So an increase in households' actual consumption of items like fresh fruit is not just that now they can buy or they have the means, it is also availability. So besides affordability, it's also availability, which is a reflection of what is happening in the back end, the logistics. How about milk and milk products? Now remember, last 10 years, we have had Operation Flood long before this, right? So if you look at the amount, 80% of households in India on a monthly basis in NSO reflected, or they reported consuming milk and milk products. That number is up to 92.2%. So there is an increase. The increase is about 16%. But what about the poorest 20%? Their increase has been from 64 to 86%, which means a 34% increase, right? So again, bigger increase in number of households reporting consuming milk and milk product at the bottom of the pyramid. What about the quantity consumed? Very similar results, 4.8 liters per capita per month. It is up to 5.3 on an average. But what about the poorest? So for the average, we have had a 10% increase in the quantity, but for the poorest 20%, the poorest 20 quintile, the increase is 45% in terms of the quantity, right? The top 20% to the bottom 20%, if you look at the ratio, it used to be 3.7 times. Now it is 2.4, right? So again, you are seeing a convergence in terms of milk and milk products as well. Again, this is a very, it's a big report, and I really recommend that you download and read it. I'm just giving you a very small snapshot to give you a sense of what are the big changes. For eggs, fish, and meat, on an average, 64% households 10 years back reported consuming some eggs, fish, and meat. That number is above 80% now, right? 25% overall, but just look at the number of people in the bottom 20%, 36% increase. So many more people at the bottom of the pyramid, or the bottom 20%, are reporting that they are consuming eggs, fish, and meat. What about the quantity? 0.9 kilogram per capita per month used to be the consumption of non-veg or eggs, fish, and meat. That has gone up to 1.3 kilogram. So overall, 45% increase. But again, if you look at the bottom quintile, the poorest 20%, it has increased 80%, the actual quantity. So massive, massive increases, right? Now comes the big missing, or what is driving a lot of this, cereal consumption. If you look at cereal consumption, I'm not going to show who all consume cereal, because that number is almost 100. Everyone consumes cereal, urban and rural, richest to the poorest. The issue is how much in terms of quantity. And if you look at the quantity of cereal consumed, then 10 years back, an average Indian per month consumed around 10.8 or let's say 11 kilogram of cereal, rice or wheat predominantly. That number has fallen to 8.7 kilogram, right? So 2 kilogram lesser cereal consumption per capita per month. If you look at the poorest now, what do you notice for the poorest quintile? The poorest segment of our society used to consume 10.2 kilogram. They are now consuming 8.1 kilogram, which means even for the poorest quintile, the quantity of cereal has fallen by roughly 2 kilogram per person per month. So everyone in India, the rich and the poor, are consuming fewer or lesser amount of cereal and more amount of non-cereal. So milk, milk product, eggs, fish and meat, fresh fruits, all these other categories, right? Same story for urban India, 18% reduction overall and 18% reduction in the poorest category. So there is no difference between urban and rural in terms of reduction. Now, how do we see this? So the data in some ways is telling you that what has happened through this big expansion in the free food grain scheme of the government, or schemes, because central government, of course, is running a scheme, but so are several state governments. And free food, in many ways, has fiscalized the food plate of Indians, which means the savings that you have from food grains is now getting channeled to non-cereals. All right, that's why we are saying there's a fiscalization happening. Savings from cereals are being channeled towards more diverse food items such as fresh fruits, milks and milk product, eggs, fish and meat. There is a very important phenomenon also unfolding as far as seasonality is concerned. If you look at the data 10 years back and you see across the 12 months of the year, just look at the number of people who would report consuming fresh fruits. In the winter months, 56% people would report consuming fresh fruits. But in the summer months, and remember in India, in the summer, you have many different categories of mangoes, lychees, etc., right? So it's an availability or a seasonality story. What used to be 56% or 55% in the winter, in the summer would increase to 77%. So great degree of seasonality over the 12 months. What do you notice now? The NSS or the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey 22-23 is telling you there is no seasonality in terms of fresh fruits anymore. Throughout the year, 90%, more than 90% households are reporting consuming some amount of fresh fruits. So do you see the seasonality is no longer there, which means fresh fruits are available throughout the year. And a very large, like 90% and above, are consuming it throughout. Now, this is also a story of supply chain, right? And availability and storage and just improvement in all of these supply factors across the remotest parts of the country. Now, we are interested in this diversification of people eating more of all these wonderful food items, what impact does this have on health? We'll have to look at, therefore, what is happening to their intake of micronutrients. And in particular, though, in the report, we look at 6-7 different kinds of micronutrients. Here, I will report only iron for paucity of time. What you will notice is 10 years, or if you look at with and without cereal, how much iron does an average Indian consume across your quintile groups? You're noticing on an average, an Indian consumes 9.9 milligram of iron every day. Okay, that number of course varies. For the richest category, it is 11.7. For the bottom category, it is 8.2. But on an average, it is 9.9 milligram. What you notice is if you remove cereal from the plate, it is only 4.5 milligram. What does this tell you? That in India, cereals are the most important source of iron in rural India. This is the data for rural India. Urban India, the story is similar, though it's a little more, but 9.9 milligram on average. With cereals and without cereal, it is 5.1, which means cereals are the most important source of iron even in urban India. So that's the first part of the story. If you look at dietary diversity, now this is a Shannon index, is a concept we borrow from, when people study atrophy in a biosphere, how many different kinds of species live in a particular biosphere, and how does that change over time, right? Is there atrophy, meaning are the number of species becoming less or more? Is it becoming more diverse, less diverse, etc.? We borrow this from that literature and use it for food items. That iron is received to the body from how many different sources? That gives you a measure of diversity of iron sources. And what you notice is the Shannon diversity index is increasing over the 10 years for every quintile group, right? Diversity is increasing for all classes of people in rural and urban India, which means Indians are eating significantly more diverse food plate as far as iron is concerned, because we are looking at diversity of sources of iron. So Indians are eating more diverse sources of iron. And this is not just across every quintile group, this is for every state of the country. The diversity in the food plate is rising for all states of India. All right. Some of the biggest increases you will notice are for your more remote parts. So you will notice for Manipur, for Mizoram, Tripura, right? You are seeing Uttarakhand, big increases. People of every state are eating more diverse food items. So the data is very clear that food diversity has increased for all wealth categories or all consumption groups and all states. Now here is an important source to link micronutrients to outcome. Dietary diversity is also a cultural factor, which means people of different states don't really just eat similar food items, which means if we look at sources of iron, and I'm showing this just as an example, in Kerala, 40% of iron comes from fresh fruits. But in Uttar Pradesh, 70% of iron comes from cereals. In Rajasthan, on the other hand, 84% of iron comes from cereals. So cereal is important, but cereal is much more important in places like Rajasthan and UP than it is in a place like Kerala, where 40% of the iron is coming from fresh fruits. Right? So fortification, which is our main policy, fortifying cereal or rice in particular with iron becomes a very important means of addressing anemia in society, which is something that we have been battling for now several decades. Remember, anemia impacts many different health outcomes, and in particular high-risk pregnancies, neonatal deaths, maternal mortality, etc. So we're trying to address many problems when we think of anemia. Now, given the data I have shown that people are eating different kinds of food items, even as far as iron, what impact does it have on anemia? Here is the result. I'm showing you two panels. On the x-axis, you are seeing the log value of average iron intake in the first left-hand side panel. And on the right-hand side panel, you are seeing diversity rising in terms of Shannon diversity index. And on the y-axis, you are seeing prevalence of anemia, because what you do, or what we have done here, is we have married or combined the NSS data with NFHS data, right? National Family Health Survey, which gives you prevalence of anemia. What do you see here? The left side panel tells you that when people consume more iron, anemia comes down, which is a definition of anemia. That you consume more iron, there's more iron, you become less anemic. But what does the right hand side panel tell you? That when people get iron for many different sources, when diversity of the food rises, anemia declines much faster. This is fundamentally the big result here. That when people are eating more diverse food items, it has a direct bearing on certain public health outcomes of critical interest, such as anemia, right? And now the health literature is pretty clear here that, you know, when we fortify cereals, we are basically taking in certain chemicals, you know, iron, which is not always soluble or sufficiently soluble. But when you get iron from natural sources, from vegetables, from fresh fruits, it's much more soluble. So it has much stronger impact on reducing anemia, right? So this is the key result here, that in the last 10 years, people are eating less cereals. They're eating more diverse food items, fruits, milk, eggs, fish, and meat. So fundamentally, a lot more proteins, vitamins, minerals, etc. And it is having very strong impact on measures of anemia. Again, read the paper to look at other kinds of deficiencies and what impact it has. Now, moving a little bit to health shocks, right? So because what you're seeing is Ayushman Bharat has now become a universal phenomenon across the country. Incidence or the probability of hospitalization of the bottom 50% of the population has risen in the 10 years. 17% of people in the poorest half used to have hospitalization. That number is up to 23%, which means hospitalization or the incidence of hospitalization has risen. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean people are sicker now or the bottom 50% is sicker. It means that for given health profile, many more are seeking hospital care, right? Improved access and affordability. That's first part of the story. But the second is that when you're hit with a health shock, which requires hospitalization, do you reduce consumption overall? Because remember, hospitalization is a big shock. And traditionally, 7% of our population, and I estimated this in a paper we published in 15-16, based on the previous NFHS rounds, that 7% of Indians get impoverished due to hospitalization. Now we are seeing that since absolute poverty has reduced to minimal number, we want to look at vulnerability. Because remember, even well-off households, middle-class households, upper middle class, etc., when you're hit with a major hospitalization and related expense, you do reduce your consumption overall. And that is a measure of vulnerability, right? Your consumption is no longer smooth. You are hit by a consumption shock. What you notice in the last 10 years, this measure of vulnerability has fallen significantly. It's in excess of 35%. That's the kind of reduction in probability of you falling to the next category of consumption. And that's a measure of vulnerability, right? If I wanted to give you a sense of what is happening to asset accumulation at the bottom of the pyramid, right? Bottom 20%. Remember, I'm not going to look at state-supported asset creation, such as housing, toilets, right? These are structures, these are assets. We are going to look at something like motorcycles and scooters, so vehicles. Vehicles are not a scheme of the government in terms of a policy measure where you are giving it to poor people as a, some states, they do have bicycles. So these are not motorized vehicles. So when we look at ownership of motorized vehicle, 10 years back, the NSS told you that the bottom 20%, 4% people amongst them used to own some kind of motorized vehicle. And mostly these are motorcycles, scooters, etc. In some cases, jeeps and cars, mostly bikes and scooters. That number is now 40%. So within a period of 10 years, you have had a 900% increase in terms of ownership of a major asset. Now remember, these are durable, these are bulk payments. Very seldom do you, and particularly amongst the poor, do you pay all cash and get it. Purchase of durable items of this nature is also a reflection of what is happening to access to formal banking, right? And infrastructure overall. You have better roads, you have access to banking and credit, you are able to buy these kind, but the magnitude of the increase is phenomenal, right? From 4%, it has gone up to 40%. And you see across all states, rural and urban areas, The biggest increases are in places like Punjab, from 15.5% of the poor possessing some kind of motorized vehicle. That number is like 63%. Massive, massive increase. Very quickly, I will just spend maybe 5 minutes on the most recent trend in labor force participation, largely because these are big changes and we have not seen enough, or I had not seen anything on what has happened in terms of the reversal. What you notice, and you all understand here what is labor force participation rate, if you see the 6 rounds of the PLFS, Periodic Labor Force Survey, large sample sizes, these are really the best data if you want to measure different kinds of labor market outcomes. I'm just going to look at female labor force participation because I'm intrigued by it. I have read a very large number of papers on declining labor force participation of women. And so when I started looking at the data, I see that while there was a phenomenal decline and there's an industry of literature around it, I have not seen anything on the subsequent rise that has happened. And you are seeing that labor force participation rate in India, particularly driven by rural India, there is a major surge happening across the country. Now, one criticism I have seen amongst academic circuit, I see that often even in the media, oh, this is perhaps the way you measure it, which means it is really unpaid work. So now you have started to include unpaid work, and that is why there is an increase. So then we actually look at only paid work. We exclude all unpaid work from all the analysis. And what you notice that there was a decline, but the subsequent increase is still holding. Again, largely in the rural areas. So no, it is not just a measurement of unpaid work, which is giving us this result. There is something deeper and structural happening. Where is this happening? Across all states of the country. The biggest increases you are seeing are in places like MP, Rajasthan, Jharkhand, Bihar, right? Big, big increases. And of course, in the northeastern states. In rural area, lesser extent in urban area. But the increases are there. Again, if you look at region, look, this is the red lines are the latest round. The green lines are 8 years back. You see in every state, the red line is bigger. Right? So for all age category, this is not just young or old, everybody, there has been a shifting of the labor force supply or the PLFS, the labor force participation rate across age groups. This is rural, look at urban. Urban is lesser, okay? Eastern areas, again, bigger increase in rural areas, lesser extent in urban areas. I'm just showing you results by regions. Northeast, big changes in rural, small changes in urban. Southern, and again, changes in rural more than in urban. Right? If you look at now, these are some less known facts that it's not enough to just look at average labor force participation rate. There are huge variations across age. And then what you notice is that female labor force participation is typically bell-shaped, which means it rises in the 20s and 30s and it stabilizes around 30 to 40. And after 40, it declines sharply. Okay. Unlike for men, which is also bell, but it is far flatter, which means it rises in 20s to 30 and then remains relatively flat. Of everyone who's entering, they remain in the labor force. And then after 50, you see a very gradual decline. So there are fundamental age-related differences. So go beyond average measures. Okay. I think understanding of Indian context and the markets across all states. India is a very large country. So just force-fitting a simple average is not enough. There are a lot more nuances which drive policy. What about marriage? Surprisingly, and this is something we have, of course, been reading forever since I was in my graduate school, marriage affects women's labor force participation, but there is something striking. Marriage affects men too. In fact, if you see, married men are significantly, they have higher labor force participation rate. For all age category, for all states, rural and urban. Unmarried men, on the other hand, have lower labor force participation rate. They are late to enter the market and early to exit the market. So marriage for men is also a very strong indicator of labor force participation rate. It's not just women. Okay, marriage for women, of course, is a very strong predictor of whether they're going to work, but it's not the same for all states. You do see states like Rajasthan, rural West Bengal, where married women in rural areas are more likely to be working. Their labor force participation is actually much, much higher than unmarried men. Okay. Presence of children, it does not affect men labor force participation, but it does lower female labor force participation. But not for all. It affects female labor force participation in the age category 20 to 35. So that's really the childbearing age. It doesn't have strong correlation for the older age groups. Okay. If you look at marriage for men, marriage and unmarried men, do you see that married men, the red graph, is always higher and flatter for a long. So they enter early and they remain in the labor force much later. The blue lines are always lower. Unmarried men, late to enter, soon to exit. So marriage is also telling you something about society and discipline and, working and contributing and so on and so forth. It's true for every state of the country. This is a structural feature. For women, it's the reverse. Married women typically, but not everywhere. Right? So again, this is a second report. It's very detailed. 1 minute, new kinds of data set. This is for the younger people here. Look at, satellite, daytime imagery. It's 10 meter into 10 meter. There's no reporting bias. There's no human error. It's available from the European Commission. The OECD made it available a couple of years back. And you have high resolution data, and you can look at all built up area. So if you study the country, and these are parliamentary constituency by parliamentary constituency, we also in the study look at subdivisions, so within districts. That's the beauty of data, which is such high resolution. You're seeing what is the growth like. And you have seen that within 10 years, you see 2010 to 15, and 15 and beyond to 20, 5-year period. Red areas or parliamentary constituencies are where you have had in growth of excess of 5%. So anywhere between 5 and 10. You see the red portion expand. So growth overall has expanded. It's not enough to say India's growth has been higher. It has also been spread out in many, many more areas. And if you look at where is the growth highest, you see here, the growth is highest in the least developed parts of the country. Okay. Again, subdivisions, you see similar, that you have had very high growth in most underserved parts of the country. Moving forward, building capacity for evidence-based policy making is, I think, our main function in today's day and age as economists and empiricists. We need rigorous empirical research as inputs. We are uniquely, I think, as a social science trained to meet this kind of knowledge gap in policy making. And our collective effort and endeavor is really to expand training and funding of support for stronger and more impactful and effective economic research for modern India. The idea is how do we go forward and who are the partner institutions and how do we make it happen. So with that, I come to an end. I'm very happy to take questions, of course. Thank you.
Charan. Yeah. Charan, may I ask a question, Charan?
Actually, Professor Anant is in the chair, so
Yes.
I leave it to him how he wants to make observation. Then, I leave it to him.
TCA, you're on mute, sir.
Okay, let me start by congratulating Shamika for an outstanding presentation. I noticed we had close to 100 people watching, and some of them may also be younger scholars. I would urge all of you to take a close look at both the papers, or also actually all three of the papers she's talked about, but and take particularly close attention to the fact that disaggregated analysis allows you to draw very rich insights. I have some observations which I had made, and I've been meaning to point them out to Shamika, so I have an opportunity to be with her, so let me point them out. The first observation I want to make is something which is extremely important, a conclusion which I would urge them also to take note of. she notes the decline in variability in seasonal consumption, or decline in seasonality, which has happened in the HCS data. And she's done a number of interesting observations relating to it. I'm not going to repeat those, but there is one other element to it. Seasonality is highly correlated with poverty. In fact, higher incidence of poverty was associated with significant seasonality in consumption. States which had high seasonality, Bihar, Jharkhand, Odisha, used to also be the states which had high poverty. In fact, it's not surprising. It is when uh, you have low productivity because of dependence on rain, or the fact that you have single cropping, which have over the years moved to multi-cropping. But those were the factors which actually contributed to poverty. So the reduction in seasonality is linked with poverty. I had drawn this point almost a decade ago. I'd written a paper in Yojana where I said we focus too much on annual consumption as an indicator of poverty. We should actually be looking much more closely to the seasonal dimension. And what Shamika is bringing down is that the reduction in seasonality correlates very nicely with the reduction in poverty, which the HCS brings out. So that's a connection which I wanted to draw. The second thing which I would like to emphasize is the change in consumption pattern. Shamika draws attention to the fact that cereals have reduced. There has been increased diversity in consumption. I want to talk a little bit about its implications to what is happening with CPI and monetary policy, something which I wrote about recently as well. Much part of the volatility in CPI doesn't arise from cereal basket or MSP and things like that, which is what people tend to normally think about. It actually arises from vegetables, proteins, and these types of elements in your consumption basket. The increased dependence on this has meant that if you like, there has been much greater demand, and this part of the demand is where you're seeing higher volatility in prices, because demand has gone up and production has not kept pace, and which is what is contributing to inflation. It's something which is a consequence of growth. So it's an element which I'm drawing. Again, the policy implications will then need to be thought through about this. The second part I want to emphasize is the female labor force participation, and I'll stop with this. There is a lot of people who are saying that somehow we have this unpaid labor force participation, which Shamika referred to. First point to make is that this is not new. We have always measured unpaid family labor as part of labor force. So it's not that we have changed a definition which has led to the reduction. That's point number one. Secondly, family labor was part of labor force and has been part of the ILO measurement practice. It was changed recently. In fact, I was chairing the ILO conference on labor statistics where we recommended a change. It's a very nuanced change. India has not yet implemented it. So what NSS is doing is conceptually correct. It is consistent with our data patterns in the past. And if you want to look at the implications of excluding unpaid labor, you can't do it post 2017. You should do it all the way back to 1980 and then see what it does to labor force participation in the past. What you will find is that the unpaid labor has been a significant part of our workforce, and that is because we have a much higher amount of self-employment and self-employment of family enterprises. So in a family enterprise, only one person will be the owner. The remainder will be classified as unpaid family labor. That doesn't mean that the enterprise is not productive, nor does it mean that these people are not earning money. So I'm making this point because it's important for people to sort of keep these in mind. Shamika had not drawn these out, partly because I don't think she can bring everything out. I must really compliment her for a very nice study. So I'm not going to end my comments, but I'm sure other people have other suggestions and comments to make as well.
Yes. may I come in? Uh, Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
uh,
please come in. I'm just
yes,
opening the door.
yeah. Uh,
Yeah,
Shamika ji, your presentation was masterful exposition. 2-3 comments from me because I soiled my hands in agriculture, and this had directly influences on the cereal consumption. Now, cereal consumption per capita is declining, but if you see the production of the food grains in India is rising phenomenally, and this is responsible for the MSP. Just to give an illustration, now rice for our paddy for that matter, we export about 10 million tons of this, and we have done a study in CACP which fixes the minimum support price. On an average, for production of 1 kg of rice, the country consumes about 1,500 liters of water. And when we are exporting, it means we are virtually exporting water. And it's a paradox. On one hand, India is a water distressed country, and on the other, we are virtually exporting. And in the wake of, you are finding that consumption of food grain is going down. So I am not able to reconcile, and then from your side some policy implication for the agriculture ministry, because it has a huge policy implication, especially on agriculture sector. That is one. And second, I have read with great interest you are earlier writing on underestimation of the rural population, and therefore it has a large implication on this. And if our, no matter how sophisticated our analysis, econometric analysis are there, if the basic data is not correct, no inference can withhold the water. So how you think, suppose you juxtapose your earlier finding on the rural urban proportion of the population on these issues, because when you are talking of proportion, the proportion of rural population, it is very important. So your thoughts on this? Over to you, Chair.
okay. I noticed there is a hand up in ICSSR. Does somebody have to say something there? And then I'll give the floor back to Shamika and we'll go back around if the questions are there.
Am I audible? Yeah. First of all, good afternoon, everyone, and myself. So I am Priyanshu this side from ICSR. I am research intern here. So my question is to ma'am is that recently we have gone through the arguments of Thomas Piketty on the increasing inequality in India. So when the thing is that as he has rightly mentioned that the inequality in India is growing larger. So are we going to be in the direction to tax the super rich, like his concept of global minimum tax of 2%, or like that to tax richer person for the greater equality of the proportionate distribution of the resources to the poorer? So what do you think, that what is the Piketty view about that, and what we are going to take from it? Thank you, ma'am.
Shamika, do you want to respond to these two? And we...
Yeah, sure. So thank you, TCA. Thank you for your comments. I only learn every time I hear you. So everything that you mentioned, absolutely spot on. You have elaborated almost all these points which I was talking about. I think the point on production not keeping up, I think that's a very important point you have made, because if the fundamental nature of consumption is shifting, then we have to change agriculture production policies to meet that. If people are indeed consuming, and it is very clear, not just actual amounts in terms of kilogram, there's a doubling or tripling of these, all these other non-cereal food items, then our current regime, which really, and this ties in with Ashokji's question of MSP and MSP heavily being cereal oriented, it is time that we rethink production, and we have to now meet the extending or the expanding demand in the non-cereal part of the food basket. And you are seeing also that with regard to the way we estimate CPI, that food has a share, of course, in urban area, think of it, it's 37%, 39%. But of that, then we'll have to see what are the weightage for these kind of food items, where when we see volatility, we all get spooked because inflation targeting is the biggest mandate that the RBI has sort of tied itself down to. So we need to open that black box and exactly measure what the weightage on each of these items that we are getting spooked by, what is it? These are empirical questions. These are not things that we must leave to, just aggregates in general. So all very good points. The point about MSP and cereal, exporting water, very well said, Ashokji. I think that's another reason why we will have to recalibrate production policy itself. And you are seeing now a bigger increase, sort of mandate moving towards production of oil seeds, production of fruits, etc. In some ways, again, I'm also doing the same mistake that I accuse other of. I'm talking all India. But then if you look at agriculture policy, some of the biggest increases are in states like Andhra, and it is in fisheries. It is in fruits. Fruits have seen the largest, greatest value addition. So I shouldn't say that the markets are not responding or producers are not responding. We are not seeing it in places where we would like to see. It's happening in some part. It should also really happen elsewhere. The question about the underestimation, rural urban. आप notice करेंगे अशोक जी, everything that I've shown you, that is why I show you estimate for urban and I show you estimate for rural, because I don't want to assume a weightage of 40-60 when I know that the weightage should be in reverse of 40-60 or perhaps 65-35. Which is why we estimate, and these are old. I'm really just following the practices of my own professors like Suresh Tendulkar and others. They had warned us. I mean, these are not new problems. They warned us of these problems almost 20 years back, that India on an average is beating its own projections. We are urbanizing much faster than what the projections were even 20 years back. So I think sampling over time, the representativeness of it, the weights that we give, etc., will, and I think they are, we are looking at quality framework, etc. But we have continued to take out estimates separately for rural and urban. That is the reason. Priyanshu, what a great question. Totally unrelated to Thomas Piketty, almost never talks about consumption, right? Which is why I'm trying to show you through every analysis what is happening to the ratio of the top 20 to the bottom 20. And you are seeing in terms of consumption is a big decline in inequality. There is a great convergence happening as far as consumption, per capita consumption is concerned across the country, right? And the convergence is greater in rural areas, but it's happening in every state. He, of course, talks about wealth. He talks about income. That is not what I'm showing you here. He gets into a philosophical sort of a bent of mind, but, limiting it to that, he, of course, has no theory or empirics to suggest what he forcefully pushes, which is that lesser inequality is good for growth. I have not seen one good paper, empirically or theoretically, which says that reduce inequality for its own sake because it will lead to greater growth. That's not true. Okay. And at this phase of our growth, when we are still under $3,000 per capita, growth is very important. It is on the back of growth that we are making these achievements that we are talking about. Right? So his theory, his philosophy makes sense for economies like the OECD, where present generation is worried that their standard of living in the future is going to be worse than their parents was. Right? That is the kind of inequality we don't have. For us, it is really a one-way street right now. We have just come out of poverty, so we need to continue to grow for the next foreseeable decades. Yeah, I think that about. Happy to take more questions at this time.
Okay. Those were the only. Is there anybody else who would like to? Ashokji, you still have a hand up, so maybe you want to change that because I gave you. Yeah, I see it, sir.
Sorry to interrupt again, ma'am, but I would like to say one thing, that growth is one of the major factor for us as we are the rising economy, but inequality ridden growth is not going to be sustainable, ma'am. As we can see that the level of unemployment in India, even if we have a good higher education and skilled workforce, but the unemployment is quite high. So can't we say that the growth should be inclusive? Which would be sustainable?
Let's not repeat the same thing, but let me supplement. One of the problems with Piketty and others is there is a presumption that what is good for Europe and North America will also be good for the world. This was essentially the problem which was happening with the development politics they were selling in the 50s and 60s, and that continues to be the case of what is happening now in the inequality debate. the nature of inequality change which is taking place in North America and Europe, because of the way their development is taking place, is very different from what has happened in India. I would urge people not to go on assertions, but to actually look at the empirics and don't go by the name of the person and the location of his where they are located, rather than look at what they are actually saying. So I'm not going to trouble Shamika on this point repeatedly. Is there somebody else which would like to come in?
One more question here. Yeah, would you like to ask? Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. I had one question about the increasing gender gap. I'm Ayushi. I'm from Jawaharlal University. I've done my master's in economics. So I had this question about the increasing gender gap with the increasing growth rate. Because according to NSS 11, 1/3 of the Indian women engaged in domestic activities, they are looking for work. After that, we see, after COVID, we see that there's a shift of women employment from educated women to women mainly below the primary education level in the rural areas. So education level is somehow less related to employment. It is not really transferring to the employment level in case of women. Also, NSS Time Use data shows that gender difference in paid work with the increasing growth rate. How do we actually, make evidence-based policies on these cases? I have another question regarding the informalization of work. What is the definition that PLFS considers in case of regular work? Because we see that even the dhabas or maybe other work which are really seasonal, which are taken inside regular paid work, is that really justified, or is that really safe to be considered? Thank you.
Anybody else?
Hello, sir. Myself, Jaskaran. I am from Punjab, working in Ramgarhia College, Fagwada. My question is about serial orientation of Indian agriculture. As Dr. Ravi revealed that our food basket has been diversifying in over the period of time. But when we see, like ma'am has given special emphasis on food, especially on fruits. Like when we see the infrastructure for the procurement and the market arrangement for the diverse food basket, especially for the fruits. When we see the fruit producing states like Himachal Pradesh and J&K, in fact, the farmers of these states, they are also suffering that they are not able to get the appropriate market prices. In the one side, that our economy is being diversified as far as consumption is concerned, but on the other hand, our farmer, if they are willing to diversify, that they have not that kind of opportunities that they can sell their produce. Like in Punjab, we have also chances that we can also shift from the cereal oriented agriculture to the fruit oriented agriculture, but still like the farmers are fighting for the MSPs. If you would like to comment on this, please. Thank you.
Okay. Shamika, you have.
So, I presume that all the students at ICSSR, you are all economists. I'm just making that assumption. So if you're going to base a question on what you might be seeing in TV or reading in newspapers, then I'm going to hold you to it. You should know better. Do you know which are the biggest fruit producing states in the country? No, they are not Himachal or Jammu Kashmir. It's actually Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra. Okay. The reality is, then of course it's Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, etc. You are in many ways the hope that we have that our policy making is going to become more empirically rigorous and based on evidence. So what you presume, what you see on TV to be the reality, no, we expect better from you. Okay? Your biggest producing states are not the states where you have, big farmer protests, whether it is, Andhra or neighboring. In fact, the states which have actually managed to become agricultural superstars in the last 15 years, it's not the places where you are seeing the maximum agitation, etc. These are states such as Andhra again, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar. These have diversified. They have gone way beyond the production of just cereals because the political economy of cereal is very different than actual market driven. So we go back to what TCA's points were, that how does production now keep up with this big change in consumption? And the answer to that is, well, some states are proactive. They're already beginning to respond to markets. Okay. Now, the question on the gender gap, this is from Ayushi. Ayushi, it's a great question. Gender gap in earnings, etc., is persistent. But what you notice, Ayushi, is over the 6 rounds of PLFS, what you're seeing is that in terms of number of men and women working, or the gap in the labor force participation, that is beginning to narrow for men and women. And this is happening across all states of the country. Okay, and that is where I think a ray of hope, that these are the big structural changes. Now, the big question here is, why is it in rural areas we are seeing this massive surge, but not adequately in urban areas? And that gets very closely linked to numerous things. First is that almost all major schemes of the government, which have looked at rural areas and all kinds of transfers and schemes, they have almost exclusively been focused on rural women. So if you look at the self-help groups, if you look at the Antodaya Yojana, where almost 11 crore women were endowed with, they were given loans. SHGs, if you look at Drone Didi, all these policies are essentially rural. So now what we need is for each of these schemes to do an impact assessment and tell us how is each of them making a marginal impact on women's, not just labor force participation, but actual earnings. Right? Those are the big questions. Now, on regular employment, you asked a question. And let me tell you, there is some new evidence. When I'm looking at the data, I'm trying to see, is self-employment really such a bad thing? Because the general presumption is that, when you don't have anything better to do, you will be self-employed. And that is a belief that generation before ours had. But when you look at the data, actually the monthly per capita consumption, which is really a mark of how well you are, because it's actual consumption and it's good data. You're seeing that the improvement in monthly per capita expenditure of the self-employed households mimics very closely to the improvement for the regular employment households. It's much better than casual workers, who are truly the informal and the sort of the segment of the labor market that a lot of policy intervention need to focus. All right. And there again, you have gaps between men and women. But again, I think a lot more research needs to be done on the nature of self-employment in urban and rural and so on. I think that's it. That's about it.
Okay, let me add something to what Shamika just said, and I'll refer Ayushi to the economic survey. One of the things which was pointed out by the chief economic advisor in that is that schemes like water supply to households, cooking gas to households, electricity in households have a very interesting impact on the working time of women. Because if you look at time use data, a lot of women's home time is taken care of care activities associated with the home, fetching water, doing other home activities, cooking. Because of the fact that houses are not lit, it also impacts their productivity. All of these have improved amount of disposable time women have available. So that's one factor which has increased work participation. Secondly, most of these women are not free to take up regular jobs outside because they continue to have a huge burden of home care, which is part of what is revealed in time use. So what's happening is the increased time is being taken up in a variety of self-employment activities for which government has announced schemes which are sort of matching the two. So the rise in women's self-employment is a consequence of a peculiar intermix of policy which is taking place. And that's why it is affecting women who are less educated, if you like, because these were the ones who were not taking regular jobs. So all of these things are coming together. So don't necessarily view it as a negative process. Look it as a consequence of policies you have deliberately been promoting.
I think just to add a point on that, TCA, if you look at time use data, then a woman in the age group, working age group of 18 to 59, spends anywhere between 4 and 5 hours taking care of someone. And these are not necessarily children. You have 120 million people above the age of 60, which means elderly care is also a burden now. But you know, government policies of extending amenities, pipe drinking water, toilets, electricity, all of these things are good for long-term human productivity, but fundamentally, disproportionately, they're helping women, right? And that is freeing up time. But from the chores, care is still very much on the shoulders of women. The market solution for care is still limited. And that's why, in fact, these are uncomfortable conversations and there are no ready answers. Because remember, no economy in the world has managed to reverse decline in fertility. And one of the reasons we are saying India's urban fertility is also declining so rapidly is, as you're seeing in the PLFS data also, the improvement, despite everything, is in rural areas and rural women. Urban women notice that they don't have joint families. They have to raise them and they have to take care of all of this. And there are no market solutions for it. Not yet. So the effort now, which you will see the government make, is bigger investments and commitments towards the care infrastructure, which will alleviate or reduce the burden of care from the women's shoulders to some extent. But it's not as easy as saying, now I have a refrigerator, I will cook once and I will feed my children 3 times. I still need to be home when the kids are there. I can't outsource that, right? And that's why we're also saying that these are uncomfortable, but these are very important conversations, because female labor force participation is not a mechanical, we just turn it on, let's get all women. No, it has a direct cost. It has cost for the family. It has cost for society. And that's why we say that some of these conversations, perhaps India, we can't just ape, we can't just mimic the growth pattern of OECD nations. Maybe this is what it means when we say India will have growth with Indian characteristics, which means we must begin to invest very early on in supporting women, not just for amenities and easing up time, but care of children and elderly.
That's correct. Does anybody else want to come into this discussion, or should I give the floor back to EGROW? Shamika, this has been an extremely insightful presentation. And what I would like to compliment you, and I would urge as many of the people who are participating in this to do, is there is a lot of potential if you were to look at data. Since ICSR has been part of this, I should point out ICSR has had programs which run training sessions for people in how to work with unit level data. Government has made unit level data very much more accessible. Earlier, when Shamika will remember when she started doing her PhD and people were studying, we used to struggle to get unit level data. What we've done in the last 10 years is made it readily available for free. In fact, India has one of the best data dissemination practices globally. Yeah. So I would urge the students here to spend a little more time in analyzing this data, particularly because, in fact, we still don't get many quality papers based on detailed, disaggregated empirical analysis. So I would urge all of you to take advantage of this session and start doing more work. I really would like to compliment Shamika for this and hand the floor back to Professor Charan Singh.
Thank you.
I join Professor Anant in complimenting you, Dr. Shamika. This was a fascinating presentation. And Professor Anant, you will agree with me, the question answer session also was very illuminating. because
Absolutely.
so many things came out which probably you or for an excellent discussion. And I'm sure the richness of discussion will dawn on all the people who were watching. We had at the peak about 120 people listening to you from across the country. So, and these are, and please remember, 2 Indian economic associations are going on. One is in Jaipur, and they had just finished their inaugural and were having lunch. And the other is in Kurukshetra. So 2 Indian economic associations are going on. And despite that, you have 118 people clock in. That shows the interest in the subject. So I want to really thank you for agreeing to deliver this talk and then taking time out on a very crucial day today and then agreeing to continue to deliver the talk. So thank you very much. And I want to thank the participants also. I would mention every Friday post lunch, we have a session like this. Today is, I think, we have already done 252 Friday webinars. And we have lined up, I'm very fortunate to say that I think Professor Johnson is in February, who just won the Nobel Prize. So next Friday, we have Professor Amit Bosale from Azim Premji University speaking to us on jobs and employment. And he heads the Center of Employment there in Bangalore. So we are going to have him to come and speak to us. Today's presentation by Dr. Shamika will be on our website tomorrow by noon. So you are more than welcome to share it with your friends. With that, I know Dr. Shamika had to go somewhere at 4:30, but she agreed to stay back if there are interesting questions. We are already 22 minutes above our outer limit. So with that, let me thank Professor Anant and Dr. Shamika and all of you to have been with us today. See you all next week, 4 to 5 p.m. Listen to Professor Amit on jobs and employment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.